The feeder chains always start first. Not the birds, not the wind moving through the trees behind the yard. Just the soft tapping of metal against metal somewhere outside the kitchen window while the sky is still pale enough to look unfinished. Most mornings it happens before the coffee cools. The finches arrive first almost every day, small yellow flashes dropping onto the feeder edge in uneven bursts, scattering seed across the tray faster than they can eat it. Sparrows move below them in the wet grass, scratching through whatever falls through the gaps. Sometimes a chickadee lands so lightly the feeder barely shifts at all. And for a while, the yard sounds ordinary. Seed shells hitting wood, tiny wings brushing branches, a dog barking once somewhere farther down the street, the back door settling shut after someone steps inside from the cold. Then something changes. Not enough to notice immediately, just small interruptions. One bird stops eating before the others do. A chickadee pauses with one seed still held in its beak. Its head tilts upward slightly, though nothing is there yet. The finches continue moving for another second or two, quick and restless like always, until suddenly they are not moving quite the same way anymore either. The feeder chain taps again in the wind. A curtain shifts faintly behind the kitchen glass. The fence post above the yard is still empty, but the silence has already started arriving. Not completely, just in pieces. The sparrows beneath the shrubs stop scratching first. Then the soft arguing sounds between the finches disappear one at a time until only the chain can be heard, tapping softly against itself. Nothing dramatic happens. No explosion of wings. No sudden panic. Just a slow emptying, as though the yard is pulling inward around something that has not happened yet. And then the crow lands, usually on the same fence post above the feeder, the highest place in the yard where the branches open enough to see everything below. At first, it almost looks accidental. The crow settles there with the heavy balance of something completely unhurried, black feathers lifting slightly in the cold air. Sometimes it adjusts its feet once against the wood and then becomes perfectly still. From inside the house, it barely seems important enough to explain the silence that arrived before it did. But after enough mornings, the timing becomes difficult to ignore. The birds stop first. That is the part people notice later, not immediately. At first, the crow just feels connected to the quiet because it appears after the feeder empties. Cause and effect. Simple enough. A large bird lands nearby and the smaller ones disappear. But the longer someone watches from the kitchen window with coffee slowly cooling untouched beside them, the less clean the pattern becomes. Because the feeder often goes quiet before the fence post changes at all. Sometimes by several seconds, sometimes longer. And once you notice that, it becomes strangely difficult to stop noticing. The yard begins unfolding differently after that. You start looking upward when the sparrows go silent beneath the shrubs. You notice which birds stop moving first. You realize the chickadees almost never react all at once. One pauses, then another. Then the feeder tray rocks lightly. After a bird leaves too quickly, the chain keeps tapping softly overhead. The crow has not landed yet, but something has already spread through the yard anyway. Maybe it starts with movement too far away for people to catch. A shadow passing above bare branches, a change in wing sound, some small tension in the air that travels from bird to bird faster than the eye can follow. Or maybe the birds simply watch each other more carefully than people realize. One pause becomes several. One lifted head changes the entire feeder. The strange thing is how small the moment remains even after you begin expecting it. Nothing outwardly dramatic changes about the yard. The same wet grass below the feeder, the same frost collecting along the fence boards, the same steam rising from coffee beside the window before fading completely. Only now the fence post feels different when empty. Important somehow, as though the whole yard quietly organizes itself around that single piece of wood above everything else. The crow almost always chooses it. Not the lower railings, not the maple branches, not the roof line, just that same narrow post facing the feeder. On snowy mornings, the top of it gathers a thin white layer before sunrise. Sometimes the birds feed normally for nearly an hour beneath it, while the sky stays colorless and still. Then somewhere in the distance, a blue jay calls once sharply from another yard. After that, the quiet begins arriving again. The crow lands a few seconds later, and suddenly the fence post no longer looks like part of the background. It looks watched, even when empty, especially when empty. There are mornings when the crow barely moves at all once it arrives. It simply sits above the yard with its feathers pressed tight against the cold, looking downward without obvious interest. The smaller birds do not fully leave. That is another thing people notice slowly. From a distance, the yard still appears active enough. A finch returns briefly. Two sparrows cross beneath the feeder. Somewhere near the shrubs, a chickadee lands and disappears again. But the rhythm changes. Nobody lingers. The birds stop feeding with their backs turned outward. Heads lift more often now between seeds. Movements shorten into quick, uncertain bursts. The feeder tray swings lightly after every landing because no one stays long enough anymore to steady it. Meanwhile, the crow barely moves above them. Coffee cools again beside the window. A thin skin forms slowly across the surface while the yard rearranges itself around a bird that has done almost nothing at all. And somehow that makes the silence feel strange. Because if the crow were chasing them, diving at them, scattering them violently from the trees, the quiet would make sense. But most mornings it only watches, or seems to. Sometimes the crow looks away entirely toward another yard, while the feeder remains nearly empty below it. Still the sparrows stay hidden longer than usual. Still the chickadees hesitate. Still the sounds disappear one by one. That may be the part people remember most clearly afterward. Not the sight of the crow itself, the missing sounds. The absence arrives unevenly. First, the scratching beneath the leaves near the fence stops. Then the sparrow chatter disappears from the shrubs. The feeder chain suddenly sounds louder than it should, tapping softly in the cold wind because there is nothing left covering it anymore. Somewhere farther away, water from a garden hose drips slowly onto stone. A car door closes on another street. The yard itself feels held still between noises, and often the birds are not actually gone. That becomes obvious if you wait long enough. A shape moves quietly inside the branches. One finch clings sideways against the maple trunk instead of returning to the feeder. A chickadee appears near the fence line, looking upward before vanishing again. They remain nearby, just quieter, as though the whole yard has lowered its voice around the crow. The strange part is how long that quiet sometimes stays behind afterward. The crow leaves eventually almost every time. One push of dark wings against the air, and suddenly the fence post stands empty again beneath the pale sky. But the feeder does not recover immediately. That expectation belongs more to people than to birds. People assume danger leaves cleanly. One moment tense, the next ordinary again. The yard does not work that way. Even after the crow disappears above the trees, the birds continue watching the empty space it left behind. A sparrow lands beneath the feeder and freezes before eating. The chain swings gently with nobody on it. Wind moves through the bare branches overhead. Then one bird returns, usually a chickadee, small enough that the feeder barely shifts beneath its weight. It lands alone near the edge of the tray while the rest of the yard remains quiet around it. Sometimes it takes a seed immediately and leaves. Sometimes it stays long enough to look upward once toward the fence post before flying off again without eating at all. The others still wait, a few seconds sometimes longer than feels reasonable. And after enough mornings, the chickadee starts feeling familiar somehow. Not because there is proof it is the same bird every time. There never is. But certain movements begin repeating. The same quick landing near the feeder edge, the same pause before feeding, the same brief glance upward toward the empty fence post. Eventually, the back door opens during these quiet moments, almost automatically. Boots cross damp grass carrying more seed, though the feeder is still half full already. Hands brush old seed shells from the tray into the wet ground below. The yard remains mostly empty while this happens. Only one chickadee watches from the fence, or maybe a different chickadee entirely. The distinction becomes harder to hold on to after a while, especially in winter when mornings repeat themselves so closely that individual days begin blending together. Cold light on wet grass, steam from coffee near the kitchen window, feeder chains tapping softly before sunrise, then silence, then the crow. Some mornings the pattern never fully arrives. Those are the strangest mornings later on. The porch light clicks off before dawn. Fresh coffee steams beside the window, while the sky slowly brightens behind bare branches. Finches gather early. Sparrows scratch loudly beneath the feeder. Everything sounds loose and ordinary again. But now the person watching still looks toward the fence post anyway, even while it remains empty. Especially while it remains empty. And sometimes the birds hesitate for no visible reason at all. A brief pause spreads through the feeder. One bird stops feeding. Another lifts its head toward the pale sky. Nothing lands. Nothing appears above the fence. Yet the silence brushes lightly through the yard anyway, before dissolving again. Maybe the crow passed farther overhead without stopping. Maybe the birds noticed something people never did. Or maybe once a pattern repeats enough times, both birds and people begin expecting it before it arrives. The yard changes the habits of whoever watches it long enough. You begin listening differently. The feeder chain tapping no longer sounds like background noise. Silence itself starts feeling noticeable. The empty fence post catches attention before the feeder does. Even indoors, small movements become connected to the yard outside. Curtains shifting, coffee cooling untouched, a hand resting against the kitchen counter while waiting to see if the birds return. And eventually, the crow stops feeling like an interruption, more like part of the morning itself. The smaller birds no longer scatter dramatically when it lands. Most mornings they simply tighten around it somehow. A pause at the feeder, longer looks upward, quicker departures. The sparrows staying deeper inside the shrubs. One chickadee returning first after the fence post empties again. The others waiting quietly behind it, as though the entire yard has learned the shape of that caution and settled into it over time. Not panic, something softer than panic, more familiar. The feeder chains tap gently in the wind again. Coffee sits beside the kitchen window, mostly untouched now, thin steam disappearing slowly into the cold room. Beneath the feeder, damp grass holds scattered seed from earlier that morning. The crow leaves. The fence post stands empty once more. But for several more seconds, none of the birds move. And by then, the silence arrives early enough that you notice it before the crow ever does.